6 artists and writers from Ukraine, Russia and Great Britain were invited with the support of the German Federal Foreign Office this year for a 3-month fellowship at Schloss Weipersdorf, located in Germany, near Berlin in the state of Brandenburg. But due to Corona, the fellowships have taken place online, and tonight's event, Conflicted Landscapes, is part of a series of events by fellows, some of which have already happened, so they're on the website, and you can kind of go back and see 2 of the previous events, and then there'll be a couple more that will happen in the new year. And in the end of the residency, a joint publication with works by all fellows and texts will be published by DCV Books. So we're really excited to see that launching in the new year. So during tonight's event, myself, Seb and Anne will be sharing our approaches to conceiving and constructing landscape narratives of conflict, political violence and contested urban space. Presenting aspects of our practices involving audiovisual research, writing and art making. We'll be highlighting works that have been conducted across Latin America, which is mainly Anne's work, Berlin, Athens and London, with the idea being to open up a conversation between our practices, a translocal dialogue that brings different spaces and materials into contact or relation and asks a number of questions in these different contexts. How do we construct landscape narratives of conflicted space and political violence through material, visual, and spatial practice? How might we see landscape as an expanded field that critically explores notions of space and territory? What is a forensic landscape, and how can this perspective make visible forms of political violence, conflict, memory, and resistance to power? What possibilities emerge from treating materials as traces, as evidence, as remains? And could a forensic perspective on the everyday reveal and produce new narratives about social and political conflicts with a different scale or sensibility? So following the conversation, we're going to open up to you, to the audience, for a Q&A. So please feel free to kind of take part in the conversation and the discussion, and you can field any questions that you have for any of us, or just on the kind of topics that we're discussing into the live chat on YouTube. So please do use that. We'd be really happy to bring your thoughts and reflections and questions into the conversation. Yeah, I think so. Without further ado, Anne's going to present first. So I'm going to pass over the stage to Anne, who's going to share some of her research.
Thanks a lot, Ali, and thanks to the 2 of us for this very kind and inspiring invitation. As I already mentioned in previous conversations we had, I really would like you to, also the audience, to apologize my precarious English, because English is really not my second and working language. This is obviously working on it in Latin America, Spanish. So I hope we can understand each other. In this short presentation of what I conceive of as forensic landscape, I would like to do several things. I would like to take you very briefly to Latin America and especially Mexico, to spaces produced by enforced disappearance and how they are contested by affected families and by forensic practitioners, my research field for quite some time. Then share some ideas and decisions in terms of, in relation to narrative, be it linear or non-linear, very briefly why landscapes, and very briefly why forensic. And then I will be really happy to listening to you and to open up a discussion on what we might have in common, working in very different kinds of landscapes. So let's see whether this speech sharing yes. On that I have to click away. Sorry. And the presentation mode. Sorry. Where is that? Yes. So Latin America has been a sort of a laboratory, both of the technique of enforced disappearance, the technology of repression, and also what I have labeled as forensic resistance. That is, in very, very briefly said, the work of state independent. In the first phase of the research, I referred to what I knew as a state independent forensic anthropologist since the late 80s. It began in Argentina and then spreading all over the continent. But in the course of my investigation, this notion expanded and began then to include the forensic action of affected family. They began to take the forensic toolbox into their own hands, and quite literally, as we will see. And without getting into details, because we are really not here talking about the forensic as this field related to disappearance, I just wanted to highlight the fact that that enforced disappearance in Latin America is not only a terror technique related to the so-called recent past in the context of military disappearance, or civil wars, or counterinsurgency strategies, what might be suggested by this very widespread imaginary of the Argentina junta that we all associate in a way to the notion of desaparecidos, for enforced disappearance, but is a contemporary issue, for instance, in a country such as Mexico, where the framing is really different. And again, it's going into detail, but just trying to understand a little bit the context. People in Mexico actually are not disappeared for political reasons, but for being in a way disposable lives and bodies, in this sense of Butler and others, in the context of a brutalized and militarized competition of criminal economies and a partially corrupted state apparatus. So the latest official number of men and women that were disappeared in Mexico in the last 10 or 12 years says 73,000. That would be more than 2 times the total number of disappeared during the South American regimes, the juntas, just to give you a notion of the extension. Among mass murder, massacres, the specific crimes, mass murder, torture, massacres, the specific crime of disappearance, so that I will come back to in a minute, experimented a sudden visibility after the disappearance of the 43 students, rural students in southern Mexico in 2014 that you may have heard of, and that pushed into the spotlight not only the overall presence of clandestine mass graves in Mexican territory, but also the specific agency of forensic anthropologists intervening in these spaces. I was interested not so much, or really not at all, in documenting the nature or the extension of contemporary terror in Mexico. Actually, I've been working on political violence and related memory topographies in urban space in Mexico and Argentina for many years previously. But I was interested in the ability of this supposedly technical or scientific agency for countering the necropolitics of disappearance. And I mean necropolitics here in the sense of member claiming not just godlike decisions on life and death of people, but the capacity to decide over human condition itself. This is what Member calls the administration of death, by the elimination not just of living people, but of their social existence, exterminating and disappearing every trace of it, including the murdered bodies, of course, which is a powerful message and reminds us that terror, that is a very important framing for me, terror carries always a communicational purpose. So I got interested, as I said, in the capacity of forensic practitioners, and I really always focused on state-independent practitioners, to build a counter message that there is no such thing as a desaparecido, a ghost-like third existence, no dead, no life, produced by necroterror, and that it is possible to get people out of that black hole of non-existence, and that they may be restituted as social beings and returned to the social worlds, even when that meant to bring them back as dead persons. Because that is the terrible paradox of forensic success in these contexts, that the only way to be certain of the return of disappeared persons is by positively identifying his or her human remains. Later, I learned from an Argentine forensic anthropologist and also philosopher, Celeste Perosino, with whom I worked in several occasions and learned a lot from the notion on this crucial notion of personhood of human remains, and that we should consider dead and or disappeared bodies as holders of human and civil rights, as agents and holders of these kind of rights that every human being is considered a holder of. And what I found a really fascinating idea, and I think it's not just pertinent for thinking about Latin American landscapes, but also of European territories like the Mediterranean, of course. Right from the beginning, okay, and here I will switch. Stop. Just for a moment. Right from the beginning, it was forensic performance that caught my attention. Actually, my first contact was in a courtroom in Buenos Aires some 8 years ago, when I saw a forensic anthropologist in action on the stand, explaining how she managed to, she and her team managed to identify a bunch of human bodies. And I got really attracted by this narration and her very eloquent body language, when at some point of the narration, she stopped talking of bones and began talking of two people, Pedro and Christina. And so this performance, the staging of a forensic narrative, very shortly, 15 minutes at that occasion, really got me into this subject of narration. And some years later, there was a second flash, and I'm really talking here about this electrical moments of like falling in love with a subject or with a topic, when I first saw on stage two women, both mothers of disappeared young men, that were talking at a scientific convention of forensic anthropologists, and not just denouncing, as usual, of what had happened to their family, but sharing what they were actually doing in several spots of Mexico, organizing their own brigades that search and collect and excavate human remains in what they call extermination zones. And these two women later became the protagonists of our audiovisual fieldwork and our narratives. So there was this initial interest in narration, forensics as storytelling, that aims to change the dominant narrative, in this case of Negro power being untouchable. And there was also, from the beginning, an interest in forensic visualities. Before that, I had been working for quite some years on the relation between photography and disappearance, along the notion of disimagination that Didi Huberman had coined for the project of extermination. Extermination always seeks to disappear the possibility of imagining. And on visual strategies concerning and countering these blind spots, deliberately created blind spots by the ontological violence, such as extermination and disappearance. So regarding our own visual strategy, it was clear that we would have to renounce to any temptation to literally produce destroyed or dehumanized bodies. So taking terror as a communication, doing this, this would have meant collaborating with the purpose of Negro communication. But also, at the same time, to go beyond the dominant forensic aesthetics of skeletons, of skulls, and of these people in white overalls examining the crime scenes. And I will get into the issue of narrative in just a moment. And summing up the process, because it's really a very, very long story, there are many years of research, but just to have it summed up, there has been an extended research process in Argentina, in Guatemala, especially in Mexico, a short one in Spain, and especially in Mexico, where we did audio-visual field research in 2 spots where families had been doing these excavation for quite some years, and we've been following them about nearly 2 years. And we were also collaborating with an independent forensic team because I wanted to keep my eye on this professional perspective, and was very interested how they would relate to this vernacular forensics. And as an outcome, and then I will get again into this, hoping this is, yes. Okay. Oh no, I think it's good. Sorry. Yes. And as an outcome of this research process, we did several audiovisual pieces, and among them the feature documentary Persistent, that is right now circulating in festivals and in several regions of the world. Quite some audience. I'm very happy that it's really taking, despite of COVID and pandemic and everything. It's at least the documentary can travel a little bit. But what I would like to get into is the web talk, is the interactive web documentary, forensic landscapes, and I think to get a first impression to how it works and what its proposal, how the architecture, and that's the architecture of information, is built up, it would be very useful to have a look on the trailer, if Nicola might help us with this. The documentary can travel a little bit. But what I would like to get into is the web talk, is the interactive
Welcome to Forensic Landscapes, a digital narrative that leads you to discover an unknown universe, that of forensic resistance to the disappearance of people, of how families and forensic anthropologists defy the black hole of disappearance in Latin America.
What happened? Something happened. Documentary can travel a little bit,
that challenge the powers of state and
what
science.
I would like to get into
labs,
is the web talk, is the interactive
Welcome to Forensic
documentary,
a digital narrative that leads you to discover an unknown universe, that of forensic resistance to the disappearance of how families and forensic anthropologists defy the black hole of disappearance in Latin America, to see how bones can turn back into people and how they are able to return home.
So I suppose there's some problem with the trailer. Never mind. The big advantage of this web talk is it's available at any time from any screen, in English, in Spanish, so you're very much invited to have a look on it. But I will not now describe it. There are 8 animated landscapes, and there are more than 20 video essays inserted in these landscapes, but we have some, I will have some screenshots so you might get an idea. In very general terms, what I had clear from the beginning, talking of narrative now, I had clear from the beginning that I wanted to and that applies to the documentaries we built, the audiovisual linear pieces we built, as well as for the interactive narrative, that we wanted images and also these digital landscapes, because the web documentary has these 2 levels. They are the animated landscapes as environments, digital environments, and they are these the micro scale of the video. So it's always a switching between scales. We wanted images, and we wanted all the kind of visualities that were interplaying in this web documentary to breathe, to be able to breathe. And that is sort of not in a spiritual way, but in the way that it would not be the density, the inevitable density would be countered by audiovisual and the narrative strategy of breathing, letting images breathe, to counter this paralyzing tendency of that is very intrinsic in this field. This meant not to be very careful, not to further dramatize these territories that were already carrying such an extensive human drama. Renounce to any temptation of music, for instance, or special sound effects, creating a soundscape that would enable listening. And listening in this very literal, but also in a broader sense, listening to these landscapes as sensitive materiality, as Eyal Weizmann puts it, creating or recreating textures and atmospheres as palimpsest of over and underlying layers, traces of electricity in this case, and traces of this contestedness, no, by these social agencies I was mentioning, without adding any emotional amplifier. And I was also interested to prove, in a way, what has been my conviction for quite some years and in previous works, that there's no need for an opposition, for an artificial opposition between sensory knowledge and analytical reading. That I'm really very convicted of, because it's very widespread, the idea that you have to choose in a way between this very cool analytical, I come from discourse analysis, so this would be a very systematical reading of things without getting the senses in all way involved in this reading. And I think it's perfectly not just possible, but it's really suitable for these kind of narrations to create narratives, research narratives that would enable to combine sensory and also effective resonance and some clues or some possibilities for legibility of these, in this case, extermination zones that had turned into working fields. And as I mentioned, and I will hope this will work. I would like to switch again. Yes, I think this at least is working. You see my screen, Ali?
Not yet, no.
No? You do not see it? Oof.
You might have to, when you do share screen, you might have to select the right screen that you're sharing.
Okay.
There we go, that's working.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yes, and then as I mentioned, the challenge was the dealing with blind spots and imagination, but also with rather tangible restrictions for the gaze and for the camera. These were not just imposed by obvious security reasons or by state officials, but occasionally also by one of the searching collectives that prohibited all kind of direct camera recording on the exhumation spots. And one of the, not all the time, but in one or two of the occasions, in order to prevent what they called a media circus. And even if that kind of restriction may, of course, appear as very discussable, in this case, I found it an interesting exercise of, or claiming of something like visual sovereignty that spoke of a clear awareness of the agency of images in these contexts. So we were forced to look for strategies capable to speak in visual terms of that we knew were there, that disappeared, the perpetrators and the corpses, but for some reason or another cannot be directly seen or shown, but maybe in some other way, perceived and captured and represented. Our visual strategy for speaking of the unseeable was to strictly, and that is maybe one of the most important things I got out of this experience. We started it very based on intuition, and then it became a very conceptual tool, strictly focusing on materiality. However scarcely detectable it may appear. And one of many examples are these unconspicuous rectangles in the dirt, in the sand, that the searching brigades always set as markers of the already processed burial sites from which the bodily remains have been already removed. So this is a visual indication that testifies a spatial memory of a deliberate non-grave, a hidden corpse that has not to be found, that was secretly hidden there and was later transformed into an exhumation site. It also meant focusing on the materiality of knowledge. For instance, all the vernacular tools that the searching brigades have developed. The most prominent is this metal bar that they call varia, that they stick into the ground in order to get out and to detect the smell of putrefaction, and to be able to locate the presence of a corpse or of some remains. We thought and did this by starting it as an intuition, and then it got really a methodology, that by observing and especially listening, and now it would have been important to see some piece of the video, but again, very much invited to see some of the video essays on this searching methodology, to listening to the varia soundscape. This is a very particular clack, 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 would provide a sensory idea of the physical and also mental ongoing effort for this really transgressive fieldwork they are doing. Or this handwritten logbook, what they call logbook, in which searchers listed their findings of the excavations holes, such as body fragments or pieces of clothing, a sort of vernacular databases, an archive that they manage by themselves, and that also allowed us to visually speak of atrocity. No, there are all the list of body parts in this little logbook, but without conceding to its dehumanizing visuality. And an interesting challenge was how to speak of state and of institutional power in visual terms, because we thought we could not speak of perpetrators. That would have been really too, at least not directly and not visually for obvious reasons, but it would be really, would have been impossible to leave out state, because state is part of this landscape. So it was challenging to think of how to represent state without recurring into this visual rhetorics of protest or of denouncing state violence. That is, of course, also justified, and not just in a country such as Mexico, but it's really not very interesting to reproduce it, because it would not add anything new to what is already known or seen. And here again, the decision was to focus strictly on the materiality of state bureaucracies as embodied by state officials, by attorneys, as this young attorney or policeman. And from this perspective, from this focus on institutional embodiments, a sort of surreal leitmotif began to crystallize. The overall presence of policemen, uniformed men, in these sites where families were excavating human bodies and remains. They were clearly sent there by the institutions to, in a way, be sure that nothing would happen to these searching brigades, but totally indifferent, passive, not engaging with the searching activities, blending somehow into the surrounding landscapes. So embodying and performing without pretending to the presence of an absent and indifferent state. Focusing the material dimension of things came with a profound mistrust in the often evoked power of metaphor. These all too easy visual signifiers that would reduce potentially disturbing or unexpected materialities in pre-existent frames of signification. I really have this allergy to metaphoric framings for quite some time. It may have to do with my first work in discourse analysis, I don't know. But here it got really clear that it's choosing between material or metaphor. But it was, of course, not just about presenting, but also about constructing a landscape, imaginary landscape of its own. No? And especially in this web doc, I wanted to leave behind at some point the narrowness of georeferential reframing. At some point, I wanted visitors forget about geography, whether we are in Coahuila in the north of Mexico, at the Gulf Coast, in Guatemala, or in Argentina, or in Mexico. I wanted to leave behind these references and get into what we might call relational or translocal aesthetics. And it was fascinating for me. This was the first time I was building interactive or this kind of space, of narrative space. It was really fascinating, this experience of interactivity and non-linearity. You know, what in the art world we're rather used to it. There's this exhibition that would not have this linearity, and so it's nothing new as such. But for me as an author, that really is very used to a script of any kind, be it an essay, be it a text, be it a photo essay, or be it a documentary, you know, a script that will take us from A to Z. So it was challenging to give up the idea of this linearity and to allow users, or what I prefer, visitors, of our web talk to choose their own paths, no? Make their own connections, stop at any time, go out, come in again, what had transformed from storyline to narrative space. And frankly, it made me rather nervous at more than one point. What if they missed the video clips I cared most about? What if they got out at a decisive moment and would not find their way back in again? And what if they get lost in these immersive spaces? But because this was also a new discovery, to get into these digital landscapes really meant getting into it, needing to move and to look around at that all the time, never having an overview, never seeing it all, without any distance, to risk to miss some of the important items or micro stories, or to get confused and disoriented. But again, getting lost, disorientation, may be the most appropriate sensation to generate if we talk of disappearance, of searching in the dark, and of forensic work that is anything but linear. And finally, it was amazing to see, and that is really thanks to the fabulous team I've been working with in Mexico City, how navigation design could be used as a narrative resource in this very specific forensic logic. Visitors are invited to sharpen their gaze, to have a good look around, to look for details, and only then they would detect these animated objects. We see here some of the bones are animated and they hide some item, a video clip, or some other resource. And so it's really about having this look and this attention on the apparently not spectacular, and really also this would a great suggestion of the people I've been working with, that looking would make literally a difference. We would make click on a video essay, and then the object, the animated object, would change the color. So looking is an activity, as an engagement with what we are going into it and interacting with these kind of digital landscapes. So I just want to do some final remarks on what I introduced as the notion of landscape and the notion of forensic. I think it got clear that disappearance has not just to do with bodies, but a lot with space. Mexican philosopher Arturo Aguirre understands dehumanizing violence as deterritorialization, a sort of implosion or negative space production that works on two levels, individual and social. For a person, violence beyond death, and by that we may understand torture, also being abducted, or suffering the disappearance of a beloved one, destroys concrete, tangible, and inhabited space, and space also as body space. The pain produced by that kind of violence eliminates the person's capacity for self-remembrance, the ability to situate her or himself in space or time, leaving her or him with nothing other than present time, a sort of contraction and negative space that sucks all energy in it and leaves less than nothing, the black hole. And that's one of the very few, if not the only metaphor I'm working with, because I really find it productive in this context. But also in social terms, this ontological violence tends to cut off any social ties and produces what Aguirre calls an interrupted community. It communicates vulnerability as a shared condition that nobody escapes from. But at the same time, it does not really socialize its impact. And that is precisely the purpose of Necro communication. The vulneration of the other is perceived as a potential threat to oneself and of the own ordinary everyday, as an imagined and fictional haven of security and of safeness. So this kind of violence creates a form of imaginary and paradoxical homelessness. There is no safe place and no secure territory left. And from this perspective, I suggest we might understand forensic anthropology as a practice of re-territorialization. So why landscapes and not just space or territory? I refer to the notion of landscape beyond the usual dichotomy as pure nature on the one side and pure cultural construction as proposed by Tim Ingold in a beautiful essay on temporality and landscape, a very classical one, but also beyond the understanding of landscape as a product of sheer contemplation or of landscape as a semiotic texture to be deciphered by some analytical procedures. Instead, I take landscape as a speciality shaped by action, by gaze, and by perception, as well by its specific materialities. And I like the way that Ingold puts landscapes as a relational category of experience, an interplay of diverse agents and activities, and a never-ending process. And I quote, "The landscape is never complete, neither built nor unbuilt. It is perpetually under construction." And of course, Ingold's perspective is rather different, is on the everyday dwelling perspective, very different to the landscapes of extermination I've been working on, but I very much subscribe his pledge for focusing on the material and sensorial, as well as on the signifying and gaze-related qualities of landscapes. And by adding forensic, I refer to the spatial interplay of different kinds of bodies that shape these landscapes. No? That would be the absent bodies of the disappeared that are being searched for, but also the absent murderers, the present bodies of the searching families, and also of the forensic practitioners, the excavated bodies that are still nameless, and the uniformed bodies I already mentioned. What I'm really interested in is the relational character highlighted by Ingold, because it involves us as observers, as researchers, and as visual creators. And I quote, "A landscape is not a totality that you or anyone else can look on at. It is rather the world in which we stand in taking up a point of view on our surroundings." And that has, again, to do with immersion. We cannot observe a forensic landscapes from a safe distance. It constitutes us before our eyes. It constitutes as such before our eyes, and potentially through our narration. And even if we do not intervene as active searcher, forensic anthropologists, as storytellers, we may become part of it, and the landscape becomes part of our imaginary world. And if you allow, I know I'm a little far off time, but 3 minutes left. Would that be okay? Thank you. Thanks a lot. Just to concluding by this forensic, I suppose that might come to this common ground and shared interests. So forensic landscapes refers to the contestedness of these spaces, no? Shaped by the very specific crime of disappearance we already talked about, and what I have coined as forensic resistance, able to constituting the unconstituted, as Victor Buckley and Gavin Lucas put it in the beautiful book on archaeologies of the contemporary past. That is really one of the books that have accompanied me all this research travel, and I found really precious. And I think it's evident that forensic sciences and practices hold narrative potential by seeking to construct or reconnect material and shattered traces of bodies, of objects, and of landscapes in order to reconstruct significant stories of human beings, of politics, of violation of memory, as the important reference in this terms, of course, what forensic architecture has been doing for many years now, these kind of stories. But I would propose to extend the notion of forensic beyond the field of science or forensic investigation, and of activities such as digging, excavating, identifying or reconstructing bodies or crime patterns. And even beyond their narrative power of naming the unnamed, no? What I was talking about when I spoke about my encounter with this Argentine forensic anthropologist. And to understand the forensic gaze as a narrative and aesthetical resource or strategy by itself. Me and others have worked with the notion of forensic imagination, or referring to narratives capable of expanding the field of the imaginable and the knowable by interconnecting and associating the tangible and recordable with the imagined, material layers with layers of knowledge that would create new knowledge and new ways of seeing, no? And making sense of the apparently senseless by connecting scales, always the micro and the macro level. And that is to take fragments or the remains as traces and protagonists, able to tell or to reveal a hidden story, a story that will never be complete. And that is, I think, for me, a crucial element of forensic narrative. No reconstructed, and going back to forensic anthropology, no reconstructed skeleton will ever contain the 206 bones I learned that our human body is composed of. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry for the extension.
Thanks, Anne. That was great. So much kind of in that. I was writing loads of notes down, and I've probably forgotten everything that I was going to say about our work, but that's fine. Yeah, I mean, there was just so many words that kind of came out that I think I'm hoping that we can sort of speak to and have a conversation around from a very different perspective in our work. But everything that you were mentioning, particularly around kind of traces of contestedness and the kind of role that narrative and kind of sensory knowledge can kind of play in making these visible in ways that kind of go beyond the some of the kind of conventionality of forensic aesthetics. And I've also seen that there are some questions coming in, which is really great. So I just want to encourage everyone out there to please keep kind of asking any questions and put them into the live chat so that we can feed them into the discussion that we're going to have. So myself and Seb are going to present some recent work that we've been working on, some of which has been part of the residency that we've been part of for the fellowship at Schloss Wippersdorf. But I think for sort of, first of all, we wanted to, I guess, give a little bit of a short context as to how we've been working, particularly with a body of material which are street advertisements or notices, which have been a kind of important part of our collaborative work. And I guess we're going to kind of take the conversation from Anne, both moving from Latin America kind of geographically to London and Athens, which is where we're based, but also I think kind of moving into some different thoughts and materials and ideas around conflict, or kind of what Anne said, phrase he used of traces of contestedness in urban space and in the city. So I'm just going to really quickly share my screen. Okay. So myself and Seb are two artists, and we work in lots of different media, sculpture, installation, performance, participation. But for the next kind of 20 minutes as we talk, we're going to focus on a body of work that we've been has been quite central to us, looking at found street posters, notices and advertisements, the kind of thing that you'll see in in everyday context as you kind of navigate any city streets, attached to street furniture, lampposts, shop fronts, shop windows. And over the last probably 6 years, 6 to 7 years, we've been building up a kind of collection of these materials that have been foraged from different streets, primarily in London and across the UK, but also from many different kind of contexts globally, both kind of from trips in places like Mexico, where Seb's been, but also whenever we've kind of traveled to do exhibitions or different experiences, it's a kind of way of seeing and collecting in the city that we've developed as kind of central to our kind of collaborative work. And this image kind of excuse me, takes us back to kind of the starting point of this practice that we began to develop. This is an image from the cafe at the Hayward Gallery, which is in the South Bank in London. And the first time that we started to kind of use these advertisements was when we began to think about how we could make interventions in institutional spaces. So our work's always been really interested in some of in kind of thinking about power, thinking about the kind of social and economic kind of boundaries that we exist in the city, thinking about how urban spaces are kind of compartmentalized, but also kind of the ways that we can see kind of social and economic issues being made visible in the city. And this project involved a performance of street vendors who were placed in different parts of the South Bank Centre, and also this installation in the cafe, where we turned the window space into a kind of vernacular shop front that is very common in lots of parts of London, specifically places that might be described as super diverse, areas that have kind of high populations of different migrant communities, and spaces where the city streets literally take on a kind of informal kind of hybrid aesthetic, where there's a kind of access towards kind of people placing different kinds of messages, announcements, and other materials kind of directly into public space. So this kind of intervention was something that ended up kind of teasing at various conflicts in terms of how an institution presents itself, how kind of taste is something that kind of dictates the way that we might inhabit certain spaces. And a part of this was not just creating an aesthetic kind of look that was different for this institutional space. It was also a gesture of actually creating a free advertising space. So we both collected adverts, but we also had people send adverts in to us that we then used to create this kind of assembled installation. So there was both a sense in which the adverts were making a kind of intervention aesthetically, but also in terms of a more political sensibility around who has access to space, who is visible in certain spaces, and what kind of boundaries can be kind of breached through our artistic kind of intervention. And we kind of collected lots of different adverts. People also began to operate differently in this space. So people were beginning to write their own adverts in the cafe and post them up on the window. And it kind of began to open up this idea of who has access to these spaces and who can make themselves visible within these spaces. The project was kind of something that we then produced a research book that collected lots of images and photographs of different spaces in the city, where we were kind of capturing different kinds of advertisements and beginning to think, I think, around the kind of context of these different spaces. So in this image, you can see in the kind of bottom left-hand side, this was at, when David Bowie died. There was a kind of informal memorial that sprung up in Brixton, which is where he lived, where he was born. So different kind of moments in which these adverts relate to kind of purely economic context, memorial, job recruitment, political kind of moments, lots of different contexts. And I think kind of over the course of years, we've been sort of becoming more and more aware of the different contexts these adverts come from, and also what they kind of speak to, what kind of stories they might reveal. And the texts on either side were actually kind of recordings of overheard kind of snapshots and conversations that we were hearing in the street as we were kind of taking these images and documenting these moments. And I guess another thing that's kind of been really important in this work of thinking about these street advertisements and notices has been the fact that this hasn't been simply a documentation process. It's not a process of just collecting and documenting. It's also an active process of making interventions. So for an exhibition that we did at the Pump House Gallery, we actually created quite a big fly poster campaign where we placed these offered advertisements all around the city. So we were again making this gesture of turning a part of an institutional space into a free advertising zone, but it also became a kind of research in the city in terms of urban space and where these kind of adverts tend to be found. So you can see this one on the right hand side is on a phone box, which in London and probably in lots of other cities are this kind of strange relic of the idea of kind of publicly accessible communication, which are now kind of redundant given that we all have mobile phones and internet connections. But this series of images kind of became a way in for us to think about not just these materials, but also the spaces or the landscapes in which these kinds of materials can be found. And this was an image of the installation at the Pump House Gallery, where we kind of reintroduced these materials, these different advertisements, artworks that people would send in. There was kind of all manner of material relating to different contexts, and we kind of used them to kind of layer over the kind of institutional signage, so that the actual kind of visibility of the institution was kind of blurred, if you like, by placing these advertisements, which had a kind of anonymous authorship kind of in front of them. And this work's kind of been realized in lots of different ways. So this was a piece of work that we did, a sculptural work we did in Athens, where we took a vehicle, a kind of a truck, and we turned it into what we were calling a mobile advertising vehicle. And this was based on a kind of observation of informal street vendors in Athens who use these vehicles to kind of sell different goods, vegetables, as well as kind of collecting scrap metal. There's loads of them that kind of move around the city, and often they have like a kind of megaphone on top of the van, which has a particular kind of call as they're driving around the city. And part of what we did with this was to kind of take that form of a kind of informal mobile street vendor and place it into conversation with these advertisements. And these adverts again kind of began to expand on the different places that we were collecting. So for this project, we didn't just collect kind of found materials from the streets in Athens, but we also kind of used digital spaces to collect these advertisements. So online platforms like Gumtree, like Loot, like eBay are now kind of incredibly important spaces of kind of advertising. And so in this work there was a kind of, it speaks to maybe what Anne was talking before about the kind of translocal, where we were kind of taking materials that had very different geolocations, the very different origins, and kind of reproducing reprinting and constructing this kind of hybrid kind of imagined object, if you like. And this vehicle was kind of placed in a particular street in Athens, which is a kind of border between an area called Exarchia, which is a kind of anarchist space, and one of the kind of main offices of one of the political parties. So it was a street that was lined with police and was a kind of site of political conflict on a regular basis. So the work and the kind of the idea of intervention is something that has always been important for us in terms of being able to actually situate the work outside of kind of cultural or gallery spaces and situate it in particular sites, urban sites and spaces of conflict or of kind of conflict in the city. And earlier this year, we did an exhibition that was called Person to Person. And this was, I guess, our most recent kind of thinking around these advertisements, where we've become more focused on these objects as material culture, and really trying to think through some of the issues that Anne was mentioning before around how materials can present kind of traces of conflict, traces of contestedness, and kind of show a kind of visibility towards issues that are often incredibly complex and kind of interwoven in these kind of complex landscapes. So this show put together a kind of small selection of advertisements that come from our kind of archive, which numbers something around kind of 1,000 objects that we've collected over the years. And this exhibition brought together a small number of advertisements, around 15, which had a particular kind of significance in relation to different kinds of conflict, if you like, different kinds of subjectivity within the city, and different kinds of socioeconomic contexts that have been particularly relevant in London, but also in Europe and globally over the last kind of 10 years, especially in relation to kind of the politics of austerity and certain issues around how capitalism produces incredible forms of inequality and marginalization. So just to give you a kind of sense of some of the adverts or some of the street notices, these three, one of them is an advertisement for training as a carer. The one in the middle comes from protests, was found at protests against Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. So kind of looking at a more kind of conversation around kind of contemporary politics. And the one on the right is a kind of personal campaign in which an individual was pasting these advertisements around Brixton, where talking about his father who'd been abducted by the police and had died in custody. So each of these kind of materials have a kind of story behind them, but I think one of the things that we found really interesting with them was that that they both disclose information as well as being posted anonymously, kind of maintaining a sense in which there's a kind of huge further narrative behind these images that we don't quite have access to. But a major part of bringing this into a gallery space was thinking through the idea that these things which appear in our everyday lives but are kind of missed because they're posted to, street posts that we might walk past on the way to, the train station, that we kind of pass by in our kind of everyday lives. How can we refocus on these kind of mundane objects and provide a different viewpoint or a different kind of sensibility towards looking? And here is a few other ones. So a missing poster here on the left, this kind of slightly comical image about a rabbit that's been found, which has then been graffitied over with the sign of that someone would like to eat the rabbit. Or this one on the right, which is someone kind of trying to find participants for an art project, looking back at the Black People's Day of Liberation, Day of Action, sorry, in 1981, which was like a kind of moment that of protest after the New Cross fire, in which a number of young Black people were killed in a firebomb, and it was a kind of seen as a police cover-up. So I think these objects kind of, one of the other sort of interest that we have that maybe departs a little bit from, or kind of is a bit of a difference from kind of Anne's, your research, but looking again at this kind of scale, or this difference between kind of incredibly mundane everyday stories of missing cats, all the way to kind of moments of, you know, quite severe political violence or discrimination, all of which are kind of spoken about in this public space, in this public forum of street posters. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to skip this video actually.
Can we skip it, Al?
Yeah. So this is moving on to some work that we've been producing during the fellowship, which will be put together into a publication, as I mentioned at the beginning. We've been looking through our kind of image archive, still focusing on these classified adverts or these street adverts and notices, but thinking specifically around how these materials are disclosing stories around contemporary issues, the coronavirus pandemic, but also issues around social justice and racial justice. So over the last couple of months, we've been kind of looking back through our collections of images from when we first kind of went into lockdown in March earlier this year. And in these images, you can see one on either side. I won't say which side, but one of them is taken in Athens and one of them's taken in London. So me and Seb don't live together in the same place anymore. So our collaboration kind of happens through this process of sending images between one another. So we're always kind of sharing these different urban contexts, what's happening in London, what's happening in Athens, and kind of making relationships between these two spaces, points of convergence, but also points of kind of difference. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of these images, and you can see again this kind of diversity of contexts of classified adverts. So this one on the left, which is from a kind of prayer rally calling people to prayer, prayer against global pandemic and disease, peace in our nations, financial breakthrough. And this one on the right, which is a kind of someone actually at Speaker's Corner who's kind of running a channel to encourage kind of public forms of debate. These two here, which we found really interesting, of kind of like thinking about how people use these spaces, both for kind of like making like political statements. So in this one, the idea that capitalism is the virus, the relationship between you know, the public health context, but also the kind of how has that there's been many conversations about how the pandemic has kind of opened up existing inequalities produced by capitalism. But also kind of this idea of these adverts as ways of generating sort of forms of local community, local resistance. And also these ones, which I think were really interesting in terms of thinking through the kind of economic context of these adverts. So people place these adverts, although we don't know who they are, and they're posted anonymously often just with a contact number, they often disclose things that really kind of essential issues around the kind of economy that we live in. So people posting about kind of live-in jobs, you know, asking to hire a lady from the Philippines as a kind of babysitter, and we know kind of what kind of violences underlie those kinds of conditions, cleaning services, who does these kinds of jobs, and the kinds of why jobs like that are posted on kind of street posters, if you like. And these two, which kind of I guess presenting kind of issues around cultural identity and race. So the image on the right was taken at a protest march. A lot of the materials we collect have actually come from these kinds of spaces where there's been a direct, you know, the production of material for protest and activism, talking about police violence. And this image on the left, which is a kind of public call for the wake of someone, a member of the Igbo community who passed away in Athens. So this kind of relationship between these images, again, one taken in Athens, one in London, and trying to think through the ways in which these can open up new connections and new narratives. So Seb, I don't know if you want to come in. Is there anything you wanted to add in to that?
I think it's pretty good. Basically, I can add into the Q&A and conversation, basically, at the end. I always think that's easier.
Okay. So, yeah, I think, you know, I just wanted to give that as a kind of introduction, really, to some of the materials that we're working through. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen quickly. And I thought maybe at this point, we might kind of bring you back into the conversation, Anne, and start kind of like trying to think about how maybe some of this might relate together. And I think there's kind of different ways that we might do that, but maybe one of the things that really jumped out from what you were talking about was this idea of traces of contestedness. And also, I think something that you were mentioning around the way that your practice isn't about documenting, but it's about constructing or reconstructing. And that's something that I think is really connects to the way that me and Seb work, because it's not a process of documentation, it's a process of kind of reconstructing, whether in kind of gallery spaces or through making interventions. So I thought maybe that might be something that we might kind of start talking about.
Yes, yeah. Thinking on our first conversation, when I really found this very challenging to bring together these very different kind of specialities we're working at this moment, because I've been working for many years on the urban, but then I found this idea of real material remains, non-human remains, that you are not just, of course, traces of contestedness, but maybe prior to that, as material traces and remains, and that would, in a way, require a sort of forensic gaze on that, to not to aspire to recreate from the tiny fragment of this Edwards the whole story, because I think this is part of what was important for me to highlight in this forensic, to really renounce to this ambition of totality. And that would also very much question one of the pillars of the self-understanding of forensic science, that would always have this positivist way of we are able to having all the data and constructing it, and there may be a whole discussion even at a very admired group as forensic architecture, there is a certain way of truth construction and truth narrating intrinsic in the forensic ambition, that I think when we take forensic gaze a bit out of this scientific field and put it in what we just talked about, the forensic or aesthetic, it really this protagonism of the fragment, then it becomes really interesting to see what you have gathered in this apparently innocent. It really has to do with the apparent innocence of these landscapes I've been working on, because these do not reveal what it's below them if it had not been for the intervention mostly of the families, because we have a lot of recordings of the landscapes as such, and they would not reveal their secrets. They would really speak of in other languages that are already that are part of this reality. So I really, and not these are, it's not, the beauty is not fiction. The beauty is there. The ordinary is also there, because these are not only desert landscapes, but also semi-urban landscapes, inhabited landscapes. So I really liked the idea in seeing, and that maybe would be a question I would be interested in when you talk about this material focus on these images, because what you're collecting are really images. These are not the objects. I suppose you would not tear off the things, or did you also? Have you a material collection also of this? Because speaking of materiality would be also, there is obviously visual materiality that's very important, but there's also maybe this tangible materiality, and that might be interesting, because looking at just the pictures, there's a whole palimpsest of layers there. The kind of posters, the kind of over this, what you, and I saw some of the pictures, this adverts that are posted one over the other, and sort of contestation of this very message, or sort of. And so I was just wondering in this, if you would read them or in this construction of a spatial narrative, spatial as well as visual narrative, and not linear, of course. I understand that would be really spatial, but how would the notion of palimpsest and of conflictive palimpsest fit into your reading? Because or maybe put in another way, to the constructing of what you at that moment are constructing, to get it all together and to give it in a narrative form. How or where would the notion of reading fit into this construction? Are you, and in which way you are reading these materials, and in what terms? Maybe these are two questions, but related.
Yeah. I mean, the way that we've kind of worked with them has been both as materials. That's kind of the main way that we've worked with them, actually. So so the earlier work was kind of collecting the materials and then representing them in these different kind of installational contexts, and it's more recently that we've been thinking about them as images, and that's probably partly been a kind of function of the fact that we don't live in the same place anymore. So we were kind of interested in sharing these images between us as a kind of form of dialogue or conversation. And I think the question of reading is really interesting, because we're not maybe analyzing them in a as you were kind of mentioning before, a kind of forensic way. But I think we kind of try to use them in a more generative way, actually, to think about what different kinds of connections might kind of come through the placing of these kind of images together, if you like. And I think the kind of I think we also use them in a kind of speculative way to some extent as well. I think a lot of the kind of earlier work that we did in our practice kind of started with quite big kind of trying to tackle quite big kind of abstract kind of issues around capitalism and the city and development and regeneration, and we would start from the kind of the macro, the kind of abstract, and I think increasingly we've tried to kind of work from the granular but to kind of see that as a way of connecting, of making these kind of bigger issues that we kind of are enmeshed in and then we live within somehow kind of more relatable or sensed and kind of felt, if you like. And I think, oh, sorry.
Say as well, like just going back to some of the things you were talking about as well, Anne, with the kind of like notion of something which is more forensic, is something which I was thinking a lot about, like in the beginning of the conversation as well, when we were showing some of the things from the earlier stages in London. And I also think it has a lot to do with the kind of landscape that one kind of inhabits and the space that is within in that way, because in London as a city, fly postering operates on a very like marginal kind of like space and time in some sense. And after moving to Athens and being here now for a year and traveling back and forth for another period as well, you start to adapt maybe a bit more of a kind of forensic kind of like output and look on it, because the ground is still there. There is so much material and it's bulked up in such a large quantity that you start seeing these type of layerings of historical moments of time, and you start shifting back to yourself in a lot of ways. That's definitely something like with the route I'm going quite often to my studio and these things, and you start to see things like popping on top of each other and then also going back in some sense, and you think, okay, that was that moment, maybe 4 years ago, even maybe 10 years ago, even then. Now it's very layered with the political kind of agenda of COVID and Black Lives Matter. And so there is something about that kind of physicality and kind of history kind of way of thinking about it, which is also very attractive. And I think that comes out much more in the kind of documentation of the imagery in some sense, rather than taking it off in some sense and bringing back a kind of object kind of based thing. I don't know what you think, Carlo.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of other thing that actually like really stuck in my mind that you mentioned in your talk was this idea of kind of I think you said not further dramatizing. So I think a lot of the work that we've done with the adverts has been about trying to kind of create using a kind of aesthetic space to create a different form of attention towards something that exists in a kind of an everyday, often quite mundane situation, something that's overlooked, something that's kind of present but invisible. And I thought that was really interesting. And so that, I guess that's where we're kind of really interested in the material element, because it's about taking it from one place in the city to another. Often it can be like a few hundred meters, but that shift of context kind of creates a whole different way of kind of looking, a different kind of visibility. So I was kind of thinking about that actually, and wanting to ask a bit more about that, this idea of kind of not dramatizing further, but thinking about how you can work with the narrative and the kind of tools that you're using, the audio visual, the web documentary, in order to kind of represent or create visibility but not dramatize.
Yes. I liked very much, and I thought this notion of drama or conflict, that is related but not the same, and we are both, that is part of this shared common, that we are looking for traces of contestedness, of conflictivity, be it existential, of life and death, and be it of other kind of drama and on conflictivity. I think it may be, in a way, maybe this is very very easy and all too easy to say it, but if in our kind of landscapes we're working on, and they are really shattered dead bodies beyond the surface, and there's some of them visible, but there's some of them visible will indicate the presence of a huge amount is still uncovered, and that will remain uncovered for eternity, most probably. So that is really this drama of the known, the seen, the not known, and the not seen, and the speculated. There is a high degree of speculation in this, also in this very dramatic landscapes. So that has been the de-dramatization in visual narrative, has been bringing it up, but really, and this has maybe to do with one of the questions that was posted about this speculate. Oh, this is one of the very difficult words.
Specularization.
That is. So, thanks a lot. That it's really about we as visual storytellers and researchers have the privilege to be able. I think there are other practitioners that would need to speculate or to dramatize. No, the mothers would, yes, insist in and not doing this media circus and to have dignifying strategies, but they would really post and would really insist in suffering. And in this, what we did not include in our narrative, because we really thought that what the drama was very much focused in many other narratives. So we tried to contribute another kind of stories. So it was really about bringing the drama or visiting the drama, and not de-dramatize, and this may be a little bit misleading, not leaving out the drama and saying this is really, there's everything coexisting, the beauty and the animals, and there are some dead bodies, and that's just life. That would be an esoteric narrative that I really would not subscribe. But to have this the possibility to speak of drama, but not in terms of spectacle, and to counter not just necropolitics, but also what the legal arena, the media arena, and the affected would need to do for strategical reasons, not to have this scandalizing strategy, not just to be seen. There was this guy from the 43 students of Ayotzinapa that I just mentioned, that he was they cut his face off. This was an image that I never was able to see. I did not want to see it, and much less to show, but I really have this somatic things that I cannot see it just somatically. I cannot do this, but there was a certain necessity to put on this image that was a terrifying image, but there was a certain strategic necessity to break a certain sterile public sphere that would manage mass violence in terms of statistic and everything. I think that's a very common debate, and we were really interested in counter and find other ways of talking directly, and there the skull, for instance, and I think the question was relating also how in the legal forums the presentation of skeletons and of skulls, that in a way skull has become a kind of incarnation of forensic. Each media reportage you would publish about forensic practitioners would have a skull in it, no? And there was this picture I showed in the beginning in 86 from Argentina, this forensic anthropologist that came from the States to have the first trial where the image of a skull would play an important role, because he proved that this skull belonged to an executed female guerrilla combatant. So this was a way of giving the skull an agency, of being able to talk, and there has been this different, the way that the skull of the most recognizable feature of humanity, but also the skeleton, not just the fragment, is giving an agency as protagonist, or is just giving this objectifying. And this is the difference. It's not about not showing what must not be shown, but it's really in terms of what. And there I just wanted to add, for the person that put the questions, I think one of the most, for me, the most amazing forums where this dignifying or dehumanizing visualities were displayed were the scientific forums. I was really, I present several forensic conferences where there was this discourse on humanizing the disappeared and giving back their dignity and everything. There was a verbal discourse on humanizing, and there was a visual display of persons in pieces and this body and flesh and petrified bodies that would be really having the exactly opposed effect. So, and I was sorry for the extended answer. I really wanted to go back to the notion of drama. I had this notion, I had this idea when you just spoke and showed some of these traces that you, in the exhibition, this person to person, that you got out of their daily life surroundings, and you put it as a protagonist, and this things of I don't know how to say, and then I thought this was a sort of dramatization. I thought this was a sort of drama, not in this notion of scandalized, but there was a sort of staging and a sort of giving us a protagonist and of dignifying these little that I find in a way opposed to what, in a very certain way, so opposed of what we are trying to do, to have to say it's part of the landscapes, and we do not want to focus on this skull and in the skeleton and of all the terror visuality and necropolitical visuality. And I thought you in a way were doing the other way around. You were really focusing and giving us this some kind of attention and of a dignifying attention that I found, or that I find most interesting. I don't know. I think I got to other ways, but I hope it's okay.
Yeah, no, and I think that's definitely kind of connected to the content, really. I mean, I think, you know, it's really interesting. I think the way that you're working in the sense of dealing with this incredibly sensitive forms of kind of state violence, and yeah, and I guess in our work there's a kind of the kind of content. I mean, even though some of these objects relate to you know, kind of sensitive issues or difficult issues, they still in a way don't directly relate to them. They relate to a person who has placed the advert. So there's this kind of what we were doing with the telegraph poles was kind of, yeah, almost re-embodying, if you like, the moment in which the advert was placed out of the kind of everyday flow of a city. I thought we're just kind of past 6:30 in the UK, or 7:30 for you, and I thought maybe we can just really quickly kind of put put these, there's a question, I know you responded a bit to the question that was here about the issue of spectacularization of forensic evidences, but I thought maybe we could just quickly go to this question that's directly kind of for you, Anne, which is from Tanya, who's one of the other fellows on the residency, a writer, and she says, Anne, listening to you now, I think of Tengiz Abuladze's Repentance, an iconic film about a returning corpse of a dictator who wouldn't stay buried. What do you think about this idea of returning bones? As you say, not just of victims, but also of murderers and dictators. Is their memory a part of your work in any way?
Thank you so much, Tanya. That's the most interesting question. In a way, yes. Not in the way of this. This has been a very, in forensic context, it has been a very discussed issue in the Spanish context. No, what will happen to the Franco remains and all this mausoleum that the Franco regime had constructed, and they made coexist remains of Republicans and remains of the Falangistas, the state employees of the fascist regime, and Franco eternizing, giving himself a space of eternity in this mausoleum, and now it's contested and will probably change and be separated and reordinated. So this is about burying and excavating again and having this contestedness of buried corpses, and also the status of dictators in this context. My work is not about decision holders, about dictators or any kind of officially recognized people that would also be excavated, also be identified, as the famous Mengele case that forensic architecture worked upon. But, and I think that makes it really interesting, the question, it's not, and there is a big discussion going on the notion of victim, because in this very opaque context of political, of not political, it's always, violence is political, but of not easily to be deciphered framings that have more to do with what I mentioned in the beginning of economic competition, of criminal economies, of the brutalization of competition, of markets, of routes, and where the state obviously takes place, but it's much more about competing territories and territory motives. The notion of who's a victim and who's a perpetrator is really difficult to claim. That would be something that the families would not admit, and it's perfectly clear and okay, and I think it's very justified that they would not. There has been always, and there is usual in these contexts, official strategy to downsize the extension of the crisis, to say they were just criminals. And so the counter strategy is they were not, they were innocent. But this discourse of innocence obviously tends to create a clearness or a clear line between innocent and not innocent people that in reality is not so easy to claim. Many of the people that are, many of the more than 200 to 150, according to the official statistics, murdered, and also the 7,300 officially declared disappeared, may have had to do with organized crime on what scale forever, because it's very difficult to live in some regions of Mexico without being connected to. But this is, and so it was probably not the intention of your question, but I think it brings me to this very important point that we as outsiders of the drama, in the way we are not affected directly, can state or focus, and that is what the forensic experts from Argentina also commented when I got into contact with them. We are not about to judge about a person's responsibility. If he was a murderer, a guerrilla who had killed somebody, or was an armed combatant. Our focus is just on the humanity, on the human condition, and this is not to be confounded with humanitarian. We're not talking about human rights, and human rights, it's not the same of humanitarian. These are really two different. Humanitarian, we can talk about if we have to do with natural catastrophes. Here we have to do with human rights violations in a very big scale and very extended sense. And so it is about, and yes, in this sense, I would answer many of even in the sense we were working on very specifically in the north of Mexico and in Veracruz, in these two extermination sites. Probably many of the people, or some of the people that are buried still there and that have been excavated are still unidentified, may have been murderers and may have been criminals also. But this is really not, and this has really nothing to do with the purpose of countering the dehumanization that they were submitted, and so it's about recognizing the humanity even of murderers, and that is, I think, the political claims that so most important. They are not accepting, even if the victims movement has very much claimed the innocence, but really not focusing on innocence, but focusing on humanity. So in this sense, I would say yes. There might have been murderers, even murderers or criminals in the victims, between the victims of this necropolitical strategy of disappearance. Yes.
Yeah, and it makes it. I think what you kind of said about recognizing, and you mentioned earlier before the kind of work on landscape of Tim Ingold, and you talked about contemplation and action and gaze and perception, and it kind of seemed to me, kind of learning more about your work as you were talking, and something that, you know, I think we can kind of connect with, is that the purpose of the work is perhaps not as a form of kind of, as you said, activism or humanitarianism, but is about kind of ways of looking and seeing and making visible and being able to kind of develop, I guess, deeper kind of understandings of certain kinds of, in your case, kind of political violence and state violence. There is another kind of question, but I'm just slightly aware of the time, because we've already run over. So I think you've kind of already addressed the issue around spectacularization, but we can maybe just end with this comment, which it's a kind of comment / question, and maybe we can take it away with us. It's from Alberto Duman. It says, how can we understand the translations between fields in ways that these objects can appear in both fields and equally enrich them? Exhibition of foraged items meant for street addresses and communication represents evidences out of the city as classroom into the gallery as community of emancipated spectators. What do you think happens in those transitions, those acts of smuggling, of making evident these social objects in between spaces? Yeah, I think people are probably going to be getting quite tired of being on Zoom, so I think we're going to take that question away with us. And I do feel like we've spoken for kind of the last hour and a half, but there's kind of so many other places the conversation could go, and things that it's we're gonna take away with us. So that was really kind of a brilliant thing that this residency opened up for us, was the possibility to invite someone like yourself, Anne, to kind of come in and share your perspective, and for us to be able to kind of take that away and think differently about our work, and maybe you know, kind of keep this dialogue going. So I just want to say a really big thanks to you, Anne, for joining us, and thank you to Nicola and Annette, also at Schloss Weipersdorf, and yeah, good night. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, good night, good luck. I really loved it. Okay. Yeah, just want to say thank you. I found it very inspiring. I would love to have a beer now with you.
Yeah,
it would be amazing.
But okay, that will be someday, sometime in the future. We'll see.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, and yeah.
Yeah.
And I would really love to know. Keep me posted on what you will publish. I would really love to know more about it. I got curious. Seriously.
Yeah, no, we'll I think that the publication is going to kind of be first produced as like a digital thing, so that hopefully will happen sometime at the beginning of next year, kind of late January, early February. So we'll definitely kind of keep you posted about that, because the other contributions, you know, will be potentially quite interesting, given that they're all kind of addressing this big theme of art in a conflicted world, but from very different perspectives. And Tanya will write an essay that I think, you know, will be really interesting. And
you will really enjoy it. She's been researching the war in Ukraine, basically, in Donetsk for a long period, and mainly. Is she Ukrainian or Russian, Ali? She's Ukrainian, yeah.
I think so, yeah.
She's Ukrainian, yeah. No, it's some really, really interesting stuff. And it also made me think a lot, and just like I visited Mexico 2 times in that sense, but also listening from your perspective really brought a lot of other thoughts into as a city, as in a space as well. The kind of energy which runs in between it is something which is really magical and quite peculiar. Also with how people adapt it and operate within it, as well as you don't really find that anywhere else in the world, I kind of think. So
that's maybe that I would really state as a final remark from my side, that you just mentioned Mexico. It was, for me, I've been in touch with Mexico. Mexico is, in a way, my second home, where my heart is, where I learned a lot in and from Mexico. So what happened in the last, with these emerging landscapes of terror, really is a new layer. It's not this anthropological constant that some very, a certain way of anthropology would state, that there has been always this desire for skeletons and for skulls, and really mixing up and confusing all kinds of layers. So I would really agree that Mexico is a very special, even a very special way of coexistence between the living and the dead, a peaceful coexistence in a way. And this layer of Negro power that has come over, that has historical roots in the 70s and the 60s, but it's 20th century. It's not the ancient Aztec legacy that is activating here. And this is a very complicated reading from some media on this so-called narco war on drugs, that really is rather misleading, a culturalist layer that has not much to do with what I think that Mexican culture, politics, and the wideness of cultural landscapes also is about. So this is, I think, really important not to mix up. Really.
Yeah, no. I think it's super interesting. Is with also just the kind of like notion of like, as you were talking about as well, with like spirituality in that sense, and how Mexicans relate to that through religion and thinking, and it's kind of is shifted into to something which I've never seen before, because the kind of grotesqueness and the kind of like violence and the kind of like imagery which is presented in a place like Mexico is become normalized in that sense. Like, you don't find, I would say, I don't really think you find anywhere in the world where front page newspapers have this type of material. Like, you go to the regular kiosk, there is image on image on image of people which are beheaded in that way.
Yeah,
it's such a draw between the individual and the people, and this kind of mass media, and how it's kind of like knuckled together, which I find I find I don't have words for it, but there is something how people adapt around it and how people think about it and how they blank out about it as well, which I find really, really interesting. But then you see like an image from the protest where people hold like individuals' faces and plaques and family members, and that has it has so much more power in that way. At least for me personally, you connect to it in a whole other way, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That
the conversation goes on for hours in that way.
In senses, we would now have and keep on talking about Athens and Mexico City and life and death and skeletons and other sorts of material. But again, this has to be some moment, in some other moment.
No. If we come to Berlin, we will definitely have a drink together. Absolutely.
Okay.
It'd be very, very nice to meet in person and catch
Perfectly.
up. Yeah.
It would be great. There will be some time when this is possible. Let's keep.
Of course.
I had a flight to Berlin in April, which I've still got on EasyJet kind of vouchers or something like that. So
we are planning an exhibition in April, so it must April not back to normality, but there must be the possibility to fly, to stay, to have artists invited. Yes, so please don't cancel the flight.
Yeah.
I promise you that will be possible.
Let's see. Here in Greece, we were still in. They've gone back to the 1970s, like junta mentality. Here they're talking about even stricter lockdown, and I'm like, we're already in jail, guys. Like, there is police everywhere, like fully like militarized kind of energy. And I'm like, well, let's see, So.
Yeah, that's what I think of when people will complain here in Berlin about this very strict lockdown we are in now. But we have no toque de queda, no restriction to go out. And this is in other Latin American countries and in Greece and other countries, they're going out of your place. You will be asked what you're doing there. And so this
they check your papers straight away. Like on my road, I have to walk through 3 checkpoints to my studio. They're roaming around. The whole city is full of police officers on motorbikes. It reminds me of the images of Tahrir Square, basically, the uprising in the Middle East. Like, they come in big groups of like 6-7 bikes, and then they're 14-15 police officers. Everybody can't see their face. They have masks on, balaclavas. Like, it's contested. There's a lot of energy going. So, yeah.
Okay, Anne.
Yeah, we will see each other. I'm gonna make dinner as well.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
See you later.
Safe.
Bye.
Bye.